Last week, we talked about Tony Khan calling Eric Bischoff a hypocrite because of criticisms about not having builds to matches and having all these random matches on AEW. Tony Khan calling him a hypocrite for it. Well, Eric Bischoff went on his 83 Weeks podcast and responded to these claims. Pretty much he said that that was not his criticism to begin with, but here's what he did say about the criticism of AEW's booking. He said, my issue and my comments about AEW and the creative behind it is really a bunch of top matches that don't have sufficient story or structure, or at least a compelling one. Your top matches, your A, B, C, and D storylines, that's different. I've seen a lot of matches, a lot of storylines, and what AEW considers a storyline that I feel are just nothing more than excuses for a match. They are not well-crafted stories. I believe in today's competitive environment, with television being what it is, that if you want to, and he says, pay attention, Tony, build and grow your audience, you are going to have to do it with well-crafted, compelling, well-structured storylines, and I don't see it. I see excuses for matches, and that's not a storyline. After reading it, I listened to the podcast, try to get like the way he presented the claim, and I'm trying to think to myself, does AEW right now have an ABCD storyline in place? Obviously, Moxley and MJF, Jericho Appreciation Society versus the Blackpool Combat Club, the tag team championship picture. Where's the fourth one? Where's that D storyline? I guess you could say what the Embassy versus Wardlow, that's now segueing into Wardlow versus Powerhouse Hobbs. They're there, but are they top storylines that you could be compelled to every week? Maxwell Jacob Freeman and John Moxley, yes. JAS and Blackpool Combat Club, I liked it. It's starting to, lose the heat a little bit. Tag team championship picture, it's interesting. It's not the best storyline, but it's better than what they've done in the past. And then Wardlow is just like, that might be an example Bischoff's talking about, where it's an excuse of a match, not a storyline for a match.
He's echoing similar concerns like what we had mentioned last week. Sometimes I feel like the match goes before the story. Mm-hmm. There's so many different examples you can use, and we did go through that last week. I mean, if you want to use, like, I think the example I used was Mance Warner taking on Moxley, and then Mance Warner just magically kind of disappearing. I don't feel like every single feud, every single match needs a story, but when he says your A, B, C, D storylines, I would imagine he means like, the guy that's the most over working an angle or a storyline, the heavyweight title, the tag team championships, anything that's supposed to mean something and be compelling. It's different than, hey, these guys are two great wrestlers, let's put them in the ring for 1 week and just let them kick the crap out of each other, because that's a good filler match. AEW has always done this. I think Forbidden Door is probably the biggest, most exaggerated example of that, because it was like guys came and went, Forbidden Door came and went. When Kenta came, everybody was like, oh my God, it's Kenta, the Forbidden Door. This is going to be the next big thing in pro wrestling. And nobody talks about Kenta anymore. Not in the sense that it made any compelling difference. Yeah, so sometimes I do feel like AEW will have these weird situations where there's one-off matches or a title eliminator, or somebody gets a championship match, or, two guys randomly end up feuding. Like we just mentioned, two guys, Will Hobbs and Ricky Starks. They were feuding. They had a match on the pay-per-view, and it just they just vanished off TV.
Well, it
was like they did
the lights out match on a Rampage like 2 or 3 weeks after the pay-per-view. So they did close out the storyline, just not on Dynamite, but it was still on TV. It's just not the most watched show on AEW's programming.
There was something you tweeted earlier today. There was a feud that had and this is another thing they do all the time. They have a big moment. Mm-hmm. There will be 3, 4, 5 weeks in between the next big moment, and people will champion that as long-term storytelling. That's not long-term storytelling. It's got to have development, in my mind, at least I would imagine on a weekly basis. Like something compelling leading to an arc, a conclusion, the climax of a story, a hero getting his triumphant revenge on a villain, like something like that. And I think a lot of times people will excuse the fact that AEW doesn't focus on those intricacies that they used to focus on quite a bit, especially in like Cody storylines, but people don't want to hear that because it's like what people would say is a dream match, so to speak. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to give AEW a pass in that sense. I actually do think Eric Bischoff is right, very much right in this situation.
Right. And the example from Twitter was someone tweeted that it was long-term storytelling when at Forbidden Door, Katsuyori Shibata showed up and saved Orange Cassidy after being beat up by Pac. And then on this past Dynamite, the same thing happened after Orange Cassidy successfully retained the All-Atlantic Championship, and they're having their match on Rampage, Shibata versus Orange Cassidy. And they're saying that's long-term storytelling. I said, no, that's just two moments that led to a match. That long-term storytelling is there's plot point, plot point, plot point, plot point, almost every single week. Not two random moments that are separated 5 months apart. Now, is that match going to be good? Probably. Am I fully invested in it? And as most fans invested in it, you have to question it because there's a lot of people, whether AEW fans, the diehards want to admit this or not, don't know who Shibata is. If they don't know who he is, especially because the guy has only had like 2 matches since 2017 and is lucky to have those 2 matches because he cracked his skull or had some brain injury or something that forced him out of wrestling, and here he is back wrestling again. And this is what Eric Bischoff is kind of saying as an excuse of a match. Now, he did also point out, like, not every match on TV needs a reason, and we agreed to that extent. And this is kind of that example where, like, it's on Rampage, it's a dream match, there's fans that are going to like this, they're going to get a good match out of it, so be it. But why not build a story out of it and make this a pay-per-view match? Extend the little story 3 weeks, and that's your D storyline. Orange Cassidy versus Shibata at Full Gear. But
3 weeks of vignettes.
Yeah.
3 weeks of vignettes.
Just explaining.
Shibata's coming. Shibata's coming. Shibata's coming. He doesn't say what he's doing. He doesn't say why he's going to show up. But at least, look, here's the thing. Especially, you just said not everybody knows who he is. Look, if you're smart enough, if you pay enough attention, you can go on the internet and you can look this stuff up. And honestly, I don't feel like anybody should have to do that. That's usually the convenient excuse that people will give. Oh, you can Google them. You shouldn't have to. That's not the job of the fan to go out of their way to do homework and try to figure out who these people are. Not only that, but you have a younger fan base. If you got like kids, teenagers, younger fans who aren't paying attention to every product, maybe just paying attention to AEW, if they watch AEW 3 weeks in a row before this guy shows up, okay, now there's investment. Now maybe they'll actually watch Rampage rather than the 400,000, 500,000, 600,000 people, however many people are going to tune in and watch that. It's investment. That's the name of the game. It's not just wrestling. I think sometimes people get so caught up on the star ratings and what's happening in between the ropes during a match. And it's like, no, this is very much show business too. Like, your job is to sell the consumer that it's worth the time to sit down on the couch for 20 minutes on a Friday night when you can go have a beer or do whatever the hell you want to do. Look, if you don't know who he is, why would you watch the match? There's no investment.
Right. Now, there was something that was said on Eric Bischoff's podcast. He brought up, Tony Khan should consult with Kevin Sullivan, who is a producer at AEW and worked with Eric Bischoff in the past, and talked about this 4 storyline thing in a Bible that they kind of presented to Viacom when TNA was on Spike TV. Listen to that clip because it makes a whole lot of sense, because this is stuff that you could be telling TBS, you could be telling WB Discovery to create promos for during commercial breaks on other types of programming. Like, you had Major League Baseball playoffs on TBS and you watch the promos, there's nothing there other than, oh, look, it's Jon Moxley. Oh, look, it's Chris Jericho. But why don't you tell them in a 30-second promo, like, what's happening? Like, what's the cliffhanger? Tune into Dynamite to see this next. That's effective promotion. But instead it was, oh, we have 3.5 million viewers this year. Most people don't care about ratings unless you work in television or advertising. I honestly think Tony Khan should heed the advice of Eric Bischoff from the clip on 83 Weeks this week. He really should. And if you guys didn't listen to it, I'd recommend that just from that clip alone.
Because a lot of people will say that his advice is not valid because he tanked WCW. He drove him into the ground. They went out of business. It's all his fault, whatever. Sometimes you take advice from the people that made not just a lot of right decisions to almost topple WWE, but the guy that made the wrong decisions that led them down the wrong path. And honestly, it wasn't even all his fault. Very little of it really truly was his fault, depending on who you believe. For Tony to be dismissive of a guy who has had experience at a very high level, both dealing in TV, behind the scenes, with talent, with wrestlers, what works, what doesn't work, he'd almost be ignorant and dumb, for the lack of a better way to say it, not to take the advice of an Eric Bischoff. Mm-hmm. Even if he doesn't even take 100% of that advice to the bank, knowing that Bischoff did make mistakes, but Bischoff made those mistakes, and it's like, look, he could have learned from that. Tell Tony, don't do what I did, do this. Like, this is what I learned from this situation. And sometimes people are very dismissive of Eric Bischoff because they just don't want to acknowledge flaws in AEW.